Well, some of you know that maybe I like movies here and there. And I'm sure you've probably seen, or at least seen, some commercials for the one where Kevin is left alone at home by his family, Macaulay Culkin. And there's the bumbling Joe Pesci and Donald Sterner as the would-be thieves to rob the house, and the young boy, manages to thwart them in comical and bumbling ways. But in that comical film is also a very poignant moment where Kevin goes into church on Christmas Eve. And he's sitting there alone, listening to other children his age singing, and he's feeling kind of down because his family's not with him. And then his neighbor, you remember this? Some of you have seen the movie. His neighbor, whom his friends have told him is a killer, a monster, because he's kind of keeps to himself, and he's got this beard, and he's tall and very austere looking, very serious man. And so he's terrified of his neighbor and all the imaginations of his friends. And there at the edge of the aisle of the pew is his neighbor. And he asks him if he can sit with him. And in this powerful moment of an otherwise lighthearted comedy, the neighbor says he's there to see his granddaughter sing. He asks Kevin if he knows his granddaughter. He says no. And as the conversation goes on, he says, deep down you love your family, but you can forget that you love them because you can hurt them and they can hurt you. You want to know the real reason why I'm here? To hear my granddaughter sing? And Kevin says, well, do you have plans? Christmas Eve implied. And he says, I'm not welcome. To which Kevin opens his eyes and says, to church? He says, no, I'm pretty sure you're always welcome to church, especially when you're going through some trouble. Maybe you know a little bit about trouble, which Kevin remains very silent. And he says, no, it's my son. We lost our tempers. We exchanged some words, and I told him I didn't care to see him anymore, and he told me he felt the same. And so I'm not welcome to his home anymore. And unfortunately, that Hollywood scene of an otherwise comical film strikes pretty close to home to a lot of us, doesn't it? An estranged son or daughter, a brother or sister, parent we've had a falling out with, a friend that we haven't spoken to over this or that, excused it away, stayed stuck in our pride or our stubbornness, our sense of being the one who was wronged. They've got to make the first move. And with all that finger pointing and blaming, just winds up in a ball of hurt and loneliness. We focus on the conversations we had, what we wish we would have said, on how it made us feel, the way it still makes us feel. And in that is an absence of peace. One that we've not been able to solve or find an earthly solution for. There are different kinds of being at peace. And a lot of it starts right here with the interrelationships we have or that have been broken or wounded in our day-to-day interactions in our lives. And then there's the wider peace. World peace that beauty pageant queens wish for and that we see broken in daily news reports that we wake up to in the morning, reports of missiles being fired in Ukraine or threats of nuclear weapons, hospitals and schools destroyed, innocents killed, children fleeing as refugees, displaced from their homes, hate crimes on church doors, and swastikas painted in synagogues here in Downers Grove and in Naperville and Wheaton. Shootings and stabbings, ugly things spoken, whether it's the LGBTQ community or bullets sent to the local director of the library, internet stalking or children trafficked. This is far, far from the peaceable kingdom that the prophets speak. This dog-eat-dog world that seems so cold sometimes, where the vulnerable are preyed upon by the predatory. And this ugliness gets us into places of despair, of bewilderment, sometimes, if we're honest, of numbness, because it's become so commonplace in the ways that it's reported. This idea of let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me sometimes seems pretty fleeting and far off, if we're honest, given humanity's penchant for distrust, greed, and violence. It's not the world we wake up to, Lord. But I would argue that though the people and the vehicles of violence may have changed substantially over the course of 3,000 years, the reality of human experience with the peace of God promised and the disparity of our actuality in day-to-day life has not changed a whole heck of a lot over 3,000 years, which span today's Isaiah text into this present moment. Isaiah was talking to the people of Israel at a time where the idea of a peaceable kingdom seemed pretty bleak, to be honest. The Assyrians had come in and destroyed the 10 tribes of the northern kingdoms of Israel. They're gone. Wiped off the face of the map. Many of their brothers and sisters deported to other regions of the world, while other foreign-born people are mixed into the populace as one of the ways that Assyria kept things from organized rebellion and upheaval from the lands that they conquered. Many of the southern kingdoms, cities had been put to the torch, and the one who had sat on the throne of King David, his great-great-great-grandson now, is paying tribute to Assyria so that they don't further encroach into Judah. And so they're paying them off to prevent further conflict and escalation. Imagine being an Israelite in this day and talking about peace. It seemed just as foreign and far off to them as it sometimes does to us this day. Israel was trying to understand why in the world was it as harsh as it is? Why were they, God's chosen people, under threat of violence? And why was God's peace not here and now, part of what the prophet had said was coming? The 11th century French sage, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, say it 10 times fast with me. No, I'm just kidding. They just call him Rashi for short. I much appreciate that aversion of his name. Rashi said that it's important to read the promises of Isaiah's peace, of messianic peace in chapter 11, by not overlooking previous chapters 10, 9, and 8, where God actually speaks through the prophet and says, part of the reason Israel has not experienced the peaceable kingdom is that they themselves have acted with greed and avarice and callousness to the most vulnerable in their communities. If you read chapter 10, it says this: "The rich have robbed the poor among my people and stripped them of their rights. Widows are their spoil, and they plunder vulnerable orphans." In short, Israel's arrogance, selfishness, and greed has preyed upon the weak and vulnerable and poorest amongst them. In fact, the prophet goes even further to say, you've even codified it into law so that you can benefit and get rich off of the backs of those who have nothing. Again, 3,000 years ago, human beings don't do that to each other in 2022, do they? So we start in this Isaiah chapter 11 with that backdrop, that Israel is part of its own impediment to reaching a peaceable kingdom in their own actions, own refusal to be open to how they treat one another, how they share or are generous with one another, and how the laws of their land are equitable to one another or lacking. Many of you know that about a year and a half ago, a tornado swept through Woodridge, and we had a big woods behind my house, about 200 trees that were all over 100 years old, and by the end of that tornado, there were 6 left standing. And about 3 weeks ago, I was going kind of cutting back the brush along the fence, and I came upon this old oak tree that had been just sheared off by the tornado. It was one of the biggest trees in our woods. And we were all, you could talk to my wife, she was in tears just about every day that we'd come home and the woods were gone. And the idea of, being around by the time these trees would grow back to what they were probably is a pipe dream of some sort. It's far off. Those trees take far too long to grow that big, that old in our lifetime. But here I was cutting back the brush, and on this old stump that had been sheared off were 2 shoots of oak tree, where once there had been nothing but despair and finality. The oak tree was coming to life again. Hear the words of the prophet. A shoot will come out of the stump of Jesse, and from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, of counsel, of might, the knowledge of the fear of the Lord, and the fear of the Lord shall be his delight. Wolf and lamb, leopard and goat, cow and bear will lie down together, eat from the same pasture. A toddler will play over the den of the adder and the asp. This all seems kind of reckless, doesn't it? I mean, if you're one of the sheep, aren't you, kind of grazing around, and all of a sudden the wolves are there? And you're thinking, when was the last time the wolves ate? Because we're sheep and we know how wolves act. In the ancient world, this language of lion and predators was often used to describe the power or might of a king. You remember in the story of young King David, when Goliath is threatening the armies of Israel. You remember David and Goliath back in your Sunday school days? And young David shows up and says to Saul, hey, why isn't anybody fighting this champion of Philistines? He said, well, we're all afraid. Did you see this guy? He's built like a house. And David says, I'll go. You're a kid. He says, yeah, I was a shepherd boy at my dad's farm, but when bears or lions attack, God gave me strength and delivered them into my hand. I killed them. And God will deliver this Philistine into my hands as well. You notice that the language of David is moving from shepherd to king. And what's the sign? A king is powerful. A king is a lion killer. A king is an apex predator. That's why you see in a lot of tribal lands in some of the tribes of Africa, you still see today some lion's teeth around the necklace and things to show power. A lot of Native Americans, a bear head or eagle talons to show these are apex predators, but this shows the power of the one wielding them. So in a lot of ancient texts about kings, you'll hear their exploits of who they've killed, who's in the violence they've been able to deliver on behalf of their people, because it shows power, shows might. We do the same things when we look at UFC fighting and records of KOs and things. This person's dangerous. This person's to be respected because they're undefeated. Same kind of ideal. But in the prophet Isaiah, the king promised to deliver peace is not a killer of lions. He's a remaker of lions. Huh? These lions and this king isn't defined by the power he wields over killing predators, but of moving predators from preying upon others to a place where they don't prey upon anybody anymore. Where the sheep are safe and nobody has to live in fear anymore. Let me show you an example of what I mean. My mother was asked, when she was going to a Methodist church back home in Ohio, asked to be part of a mission to a small church community in Liberia. Liberia had just gone through a massive civil war where some of the combatants were as young as 6 child soldiers. She was coming about a year after the aftermath of their civil war. As they were doing church camp and vacation Bible school and biblical camp with the kids there, she came upon a young man about 16 years old. And he asked her, as he was working with metal, if she would like to look at some of the crafts of his shop. She said, sure. And she came over to this young man, and he handed her these little crosses made out of bullet shells. And she said, these are interesting. Where did you get these? He said, I used to be a soldier with the Republic Army. I used to be a killer. Again, when she met him, he's 16, a high school sophomore age. He's talking about being a killer, past tense. He said, along the way, after the war, I found Jesus. And so I take these old shells that remind me of who I used to be, and I fashion them into the one who's changed me from a killer to who I am today. The prophet Isaiah talks about reshaping lions and changing who we are at our deepest violence and capacities for evil, and reshaping them to be something beautiful and peace-filled. It's a very different kind of king that we're talking about here, is it not? A very different kind of imagining peace. One who says to his disciples as they pull swords at the garden to strike out and to protect their king, don't you know I could call down 6,000 legions of angels? 72,000 angels. An angelic host, an army. Put your swords away. This isn't my kingdom. In the movie Gran Torino, Clint Eastwood plays a grumbling, bigoted, old Korean War vet who's very set in his ways and his biases. His neighbor Tao is an immigrant Hmong person from Southeast Asia, and he is of an age where he is recruited by a local gang, which his cousin runs, to go steal Eastwood's character's prized possession, his Gran Torino, from his garage. Tao fouls it up, is caught by Eastwood as he runs off the rest of the gang. with his Korean War rifle. And the aunt of Tao makes her nephew work with Walt Eastwood's character, and they have this begrudging give and take until, over time, a mutual respect and friendship develops intergenerationally and interculturally amongst these two men. Walt goes to see his priest, and the priest often asks him if he wants confession, but he's a young guy and he's inexperienced in the ways of life, and Walt distrusts that because Walt has no peace in his life. If you've seen the film, I don't want to spoil too much of it. I'm afraid I'm going to. Walt doesn't have peace with his family. His wife has died. His kids are aloof and distant. And almost all their conversations have to do with when he dies, who's going to get what. And Walt, being still very much alive, is put off by that. Go imagine, go figure. He doesn't seem to like his neighbors a whole lot. He holds all kinds of animosities and struggles. And then in the movie you see that this gang of thugs, has all the people in the community living in fear. They steal from them, they threaten them, they coerce them. A microcosm maybe of some of what we face in the wider world. They're scared of these guys and their guns and their drug dealing and their violence. They live in fear constantly. Something awful happens to Tao's sister. She's assaulted by one of these gang members. And Tao is so angry that he plots revenge. He goes to the oldest play in the book that we have. If somebody wrongs us, we're going to get even. And he tells Walt that he's going to go and kill these guys. He wants to know where Walt keeps his guns. He goes down to get them, and Walt locks him in. And at the end of the movie, Walt goes to confession. And he tells the priest how he lied once and how he did something to a jilted young girl and left her without picking her up for a date. And he stole some candy once. And the priest said, "Is that all?" He said, "I haven't told anybody this for a lifetime, and you're making little of my confession. I'm here to confess." And the priest says, "Walt, don't do something you're going to regret," because through the whole movie, he's been kind of this violent, default, gruff, angry man. And the priest suspects he's going to go and take care of this gang in a form of vigilante justice, because that's the way of the gun. That's the way of the world, the cycle of violence. And he says, "Walt, you'll never have peace that way." He says, "I am at peace." In the last scene, Walt goes before the gang's house, and he insults them. He says all kinds of ugly, nasty things to get them riled up. He baits them. He says, "You got a light?" And they all look around, nervously fingering their weapons. He says, "Me? I got a light." And he reaches his hand into his jacket pocket as if to draw his weapon. And then in the powerful moment of film, Walt says, "Hail Mary, full of grace." He begins to say the rosary, this Catholic man. He pulls his hand from his jacket as they light him up with bullets. And they kill him. And in his open hand is a lighter with his army battalion emblazoned upon it. The former lion, the former killer, who confessed to Tao, not the priest, that the worst moment of his life was in a foxhole in Korea, where in hand-to-hand combat he had to take another man's life. And it wasn't a day of his life that he didn't go by seeing that man and haunted by that act of violence. And in the last act of his life, this killer takes on the bullets of a violent gang so that they may be witnessed by the entire neighborhood and are arrested. The man hasn't used violence, but peace to protect those who've been preyed upon, who have lived in fear. The wolf will lie down with the sheep. The lion will learn not to hunt anymore. That's the way of this king's peace. Amen.